Hello, everyone. Happy International Anti-Corruption Day, first of all, and welcome to the 48th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I have to say up front, it coincided very naturally. I didn't plan it when originally I was scheduling this talk with Justin a couple of months ago. Um, Although, of course, there are always activities around this period, right? And then it just ended up, oh, well, okay, actually, it was December 9th, so that was really nice. And this is as well another talk that I wanted to hold for a really long time. I met Justin, I believe it was almost a year and a half ago, right? It was summer around,
Time is flying, yeah.
yeah, last year in Vienna. And I was able to listen to a presentation that also kind of built on the work that he was doing already on measuring corruption related to the paper that is about to be published as well, if I'm correct, right, Justin?
Yes, the paper I'm presenting today is conditionally accepted at political studies. We have to make a few minor superficial changes, and my co-author and I are, we're going to do that probably after this, right after this talk, because this is a good chance to revisit and get it completely off our desk.
Right, right. So I was kind of beating my time, just waiting for the right moment to email Justin and say, okay, I think now it's time to kind of have a public talk about it. Although, of course, a draft had already been hosted on Justin's website for a while. Really excellent work, and so I very much look forward to delving deep into it today. Before we begin, just the regular housekeeping stuff. The meeting is being recorded. As you know, it will be uploaded to YouTube in about 4 weeks. The presentation is not divided between Justin's paper and then Q&A, but rather you have any question or comment during the presentation itself, don't feel shy. You can just click the hand emoji or just gesture to the camera, and I will invite you to unmute yourself, and then you can participate. The first time that you participate, please, if you can just tell us just in one line about your affiliation and what brings you here, and it will be also a good opportunity for Justin to get to know everyone here. Uh, Other than that, yeah, of course, I am Joseph Pochi Alvarez. I'm your host today, and happy to see you all, and of course, delighted to have Justin here with us. So, Justin, feel free to share your screen, and if you could start by saying a little bit about yourself, and then you can just go into the presentation itself.
Okay, hold on a second. I plan to do it one way, and now hold on a second. Let me see if I can make this work. Flip. I used to, um, am I still, can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, right now we can see it as full screen.
Okay, I wanted to, hold on a second. I want to, because I have it on this screen over here, but I don't want to give a talk where it looks like I'm trying to face away from you.
Sure. Take your
So,
time. That's all right.
let me move this around a bit. Okay, I'm gonna change to this screen. Okay, now you guys should be seeing nothing.
We can
Um,
see your desktop.
yeah, desktop, right?
Yeah,
And um, I can move this over here, and I can set this there.
great.
And I'll drag the zoom window over to my other thing. Sorry for the technical issue. My name is Justin Esarey. I'm a professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. I've been here since 2018. Um, and I've been working for a number of years on issues related to corruption. A lot of my first work had to do with studying the relationship between women's representation in government and corruption. And actually, that's going to come up again today. But this project is about measuring changes in corruption over time. And just for those of you who wish to follow along at home, The talk is actually available on my website. It's a HTML file, so you can access it in your browser. Just go to, hold on, let me see if I can. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. My name .com and then measuring corruption.html. And then you should be able to see it. You can also get access to the paper. I didn't post that full link because the link is kind of annoying to type out. It's a long name. But if you want to take a look at that, it's also posted on my website. And like I said, that link is a little bit, or that paper is from October 16th of this year. We're probably going to make a few small changes to it, but mostly just superficial stuff, moving things around, explaining things a little bit better, things like that. But we still do have some time to make some edits. So if you have any questions or comments, feedback, things you think we should put into the paper, I'm very open to that. I also want to mention my co-author. My co-author is Maya Dalton. She was one of my undergraduate students here at Wake, a Wake Forest Research Fellow. And now she is a PhD candidate in political science and social data analytics, a dual degree program at Penn State University. She is actually, I think, on the job market for non-academic and alt-academic jobs this year. So if you're interested in hiring, you can probably find her on LinkedIn, would be my guess. But she's actually the first author on this paper. So let's just go right to it. So the problem that this paper addresses has to do with trying to track how corruption, aggregated corruption in a country, changes over time. And I probably don't, in this group, need to belabor the many questions and struggles, difficulties that exist in trying to measure corruption. So I will just say that although there are many different approaches, some of them have to do with subnational measures, some of them have to do with um, industry or sector specific measures of corruption or institution specific measures of corruption. What we're interested in is trying to capture aggregate abuse of public office for private gain at the national level over time. It's important for comparative research. It's important for testing theories that relate institutions to corruption. And there are lots of measures out there. I've mentioned five of them here, five of the arguably the most important time series cross-sectional country level measures of corruption. The first one here in the left column is the VDEM control of corruption, or political, I'm sorry, the VDEM political corruption index. The second one is the World Bank Governance Indicators Control of Corruption Estimate, or CCE. The third one is the Bayesian Corruption Index, which is a cousin of the WBGI-CCE. The fourth one here is the ICRG, International Country Risk Group Political Risk of Corruption measure. And then finally, the venerable Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. And these have all been rescaled so that they vary between 0 and 100, and so that higher scores indicate more corruption, which is not always true for these indices, but I've scaled them that way. And so if we just plot the data in this is a pairs scatter plot with correlations in the upper correlations noted in the upper right triangle, and the scatter plots in the lower right triangle. You can see that all these five measures are very closely related to each other. And so although we might worry about their conceptual validity, whether they comprehensively and completely measure corruption, whether they might be biased in some ways, whether there might be measurement error, we might be reassured by the fact that five very different approaches all come to roughly the same conclusion about the aggregate level of corruption in a country. You can see the correlations are, generally pretty large. Many of them are above 0.9. On the other hand, if you extract country and global year fixed effects from those measures, and then plot what's left. What's left is within country variation and corruption. The relationship between these measures gets a lot weaker. So there's still a relationship. You can see in the scatter plots here in the right hand side. The measures are obviously still related to each other positively. But the correlations are considerably weaker, on the order of zero point 0.2, zero point 0.3 instead of zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9. And visually, you can tell there's just a lot more noise and a lot less strong of a relationship among the measures. So this is the problem. The problem is that we apparently cannot or are not doing a very good job of measuring changes in corruption inside of a country over time with our major measures. Because all of the criticisms that you might be thinking of these measures become a lot more biting when we lose the convergent validity that we apparently achieve in cross-sectional sort of non non-trend based non-trend based when you include the between country variance is essentially what I'm trying to say here. We're really good at telling which countries are more corrupt than others, but we are much less good at telling when a country becomes more or less corrupt. Joseph, I see your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Um, for those less statistics inclined here and as well later watching on YouTube, could you walk us through very quickly through this inclusion of time and country fixed effects in common and corruption measurement indices?
I am going to do that later in the
Okay.
presentation at an excruciating level of clarity.
All
So
right, perfect.
I'm very proud of myself for having anticipated a question on the next slide. Yes, I will. And by the time you're done with this, you'll hope never to see another Greek letter again. Um, but for now, I think it suffices to say that what we've taken out here on the right-hand side is all global trends, right? So any global drift in corruption, like the entire world becoming more or less corrupt as a group. We've also eliminated the systematic between country differences in corruption. So, Italy, for example, and South Africa have consistently different levels of corruption from each other over time, averaging over time. If we take out that difference, what's left is the trend, right? The trend in within South Africa, within Italy. And so what this graph is showing you is, although we're capturing something, right? All the measures are picking up something. They are way less consistent at picking up whatever that thing is. And this has consequences. There are many, many things that we do with these measures that rely on the trends of corruption measurements being accurate, being valid, and reliable. So let's start with just a very, very basic descriptive statistics show here of corruption in China and the PRC and corruption in the United States of America from 1980 to 2020. The temporal coverage varies a little bit by the measure. These are our five measures. This one here is for China. This one here is for the United States. And what do we see? Well, let's start with China here. Just look between 2010 and 2020. Is corruption going up in China, or is it going down in China, or is it staying the same? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask the IICRG, it's staying the same. If you ask all the other measures, it's going down. Um, Take a look at the United States. Uh, is corruption in the United States going up or staying constant in the last 10, 15 years? It depends on who you ask. Some of the measures, there's actually you can see a pretty strong upward trend, especially since 2000. In other cases, like the VDEM measure, we're virtually unchanged. So that's a very different conclusion you're coming to on these two countries for a very basic question based on which measure you decide to use. Giovanna, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. And you hear me? Sorry. Yeah. I just wondering the before graph was like an average between all the countries by year. The
This one
previous
here?
graph. Yeah, that one. Yeah, that
No.
one. It's just
So these data points, every point is a country year. So this is 20 years
all
of data from the international system. So in the left-hand side here, we're observing China 20 times, right? We're observing the United
yeah.
States 20 times for most of the measures.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Which is relevant because, ultimately we are, this talk is about measuring change over time, so we need to have the temporal variance. Um, well, so I wanted to go on here, and so just building on this graph, another very basic question. Did the United States become more or less corrupt during the Obama administration? For those of you who are not passionate followers of the United States political system, and I envy you greatly, Obama was president between 2008 and 2016, or technically 2009 and 2016. And so essentially what we're estimating is put in a dummy variable for those years in a time series analysis of the US level of corruption and just estimate what's the coefficient on Obama when you remove sort of overall trends over time. And what do we see here? Well, what we see is that, again, the answer depends on who you ask. If looking at the levels of US corruption, so not the first differences, but the levels, the BCI said corruption went up. The VDEM measure says corruption went down. The ICRG says it went up, but it's statistically insignificant. Same with the WVGI. The TICPI says it went down, but it's statistically insignificant. That is a very troubling thing to find, right? We can't even answer a extremely basic question about, like, is the US becoming more or less corrupt during a person's, presidency? I also repeated this analysis with first differences of the dependent variable. We can talk about statistically why that might be a better idea or a worse idea. But you can see, although there's statistically insignificant in every case, the signs actually still vary. So that you're still not getting a very consistent answer from these measures. And then we're going to loop back to this application later, but I just wanted to show you an example of a more sophisticated analysis, which we'll revisit in a few minutes. And this is just a dynamic instrumental variable model where we're predicting corruption using the proportion of women in the lower or sole house of parliament over a roughly 19-year period. Depends a little bit on which measure you use in the international system. So 76 countries for which we have data. These are actually all democratic countries, so that's why the number is lower, because the initial analysis was of democracies only. And what do we find here? Well, we find that, again, the effect of women in parliament on corruption is inconsistent, right? So ignore the last column for a moment. That we'll come back to. But the first 5 columns here are all the 5 different measures that I just mentioned. And what you can see is, some are saying there's a very precise 0. Some are saying that there's, so that would be VDEM and BCI. Some are saying that there's a statistically significant negative effect. And some are saying that there's a substantively pretty small and statistically insignificant negative effect. So very different answers to a important question that's of theoretical importance, I think, well, at least to me, and probably to a lot of other corruption researchers as well. So I'm hoping I've convinced you that we need to address this problem. We need to try to improve the consistency of measurement of trends in corruption over time at the country level. I've elided a lot of potential problems. So, for example, what does it mean to have a comprehensive concept of corruption? We can debate some of that stuff in the Q&A. For right now, I'm going to posit that there is such a thing as aggregate corruption and that we care about it. And we can debate those 2 points later, but for now, I'm going to stipulate those things. Joseph, question.
Yes. I don't know if you address this later, but I think this point is so important. I would like to stay here for a minute at least.
Sure.
Well, this normally what we find in academic research, right? So we select a measurement of corruption, CPI or the World Bank or VDEM or whatever, right? And then because we're interested in causes or consequences, we run regression analysis with whatever other variable we're interested in.
Yep.
We find some conclusion that would represent, right? Basically, what
Hmm.
you're saying is that the answer that we reach will very much depend on what index of corruption we choose, and that for the most part, it could be any of them because they are not consistent at all. Is that correct?
So it's already understood that some inferences are sensitive to the selection of measure, and that the corruption measures are more similar between countries than they are within countries. So Standard, for example, already finds that. And the response in the literature has been, for the most part, to try everything, or at least try a bunch of things and see how consistent the answers are. And so that's something I've done in my own work, right? I estimate a model, I find something using a particular measure of corruption. I then try it with some other measures. Sometimes I get the same answer. That's great. Sometimes I get different answers, and then I have to decide which answer I think is the best and for what reason. And of course, I'm able to make arguments with that. But what I'd really like to do is to have a measure that I can be more confident in. And so I don't think so. To answer your question very directly, yes, sometimes the answer you get does depend on the measure you choose. And occasionally, just to go back for a second here, occasionally we can appeal to some characteristics of the measure to maybe justify why one might be better than another. For example, the World Bank Governance Indicator might be available for fewer years than, let's say, the VDEM measure, which is available all the way back to 1789. The VDEM measure has excellent cross-national coverage over that time. On the other hand, the VDEM measure is based effectively on expert assessments. If for some reason we think that doesn't correspond to the concept of corruption that we're interested in, if we're more interested in aggregate perceptions of corruption, we might lean on a more survey-based measure. The WBGI has way more broad survey-based components in it. And so sometimes we can appeal to those arguments, but ultimately we still have a question, right, of which result we decide is most credible. And what I'm hoping we can do is to identify the common signal that all of these measures are tracking, extract that common signal, and then come to conclusions that we can say are consistent with that common signal, right? That are where we understand what is causing or affecting the aggregate level of corruption on which all these measures agree. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love this point because, as you know, a big part of the community of the roundtable series are public officials,
Mhm.
people working for NGOs, private companies. Not all of them will be as familiar with the technical details of the methodology itself. Um, so I would like it if you could kind of spell out, even though it's incredibly obvious for you, what would be the problems of this issue of not of basically being able to shop around for the type of measurement that better corroborates our findings. And for example, the first thing that comes to mind to me is that, as you know, in academic research, well, specifically in the process of publishing results, there's a bias in favor of statistically significant results, right?
Yep.
And so, for example, potentially then using a measurement of corruption that does not provide those results that are statistically significant would reduce the chances of getting published. And so a researcher potentially may say, okay, then let me try with a different measurement and see if I find more interesting result that will get this paper published. So that would be, for example, the first, red flag that comes to mind when listening to this. What else? What other issues are we facing here?
I mean, there are innumerable problems that are created. So, just again, for starters, like very, very basic facts. Like, if you're a policymaker trying to figure out is corruption in my country going up or down or staying the same, right? Now, for that particular question, it may be more interesting to have sector specific or institution specific measures. We can't, I don't think what anything I'm going to do today sort of addresses every potential problem that I can see with asking that question. But at a minimum, I should be able to have some confidence in, saying overall in the aggregate, averaging over all institutions and sectors, corruption is getting worse or getting better in my country. And right now, that's not something we can really say. I can say it, but I might get different answers depending on what measure I use. And that is a problem, right? It's a problem for identifying whether corruption is a policy issue I need to be addressing. Is the trend sort of concerning? And it's also a problem if I'm trying to figure out how to fix it, right? So there was a while ago. I'm not sure that this is fully passed or not. I'm not that politically connected, but I know that for a time NGOs and governments were very interested in feminization as a potential policy, attractive policy solution to corruption. And in order to be able to justify that, we have to be able to at least say that a change in women's representation in some institution causes, in the name and Rubin sense of that word, statistically, it causes a change in corruption. And right now, well, I can say something about it. I can, in some sense, take a vote of all five measures, or I can try to make a detailed theoretical or other sort of non-statistical justification for why I should believe one of these results more than the others. But we still have that ambiguity. And so what ends up happening in the scientific literature, I think, is that a responsible researcher will report all the results, but will highlight the ones they think are most credible for some reason. And Joseph's right. If those results are null, unless you're overturning something that's very widely held and your null is extremely credible, good luck getting that published. On the other hand, if you're a little bit unethical, maybe what you do is you highlight the positive results and you ignore the contradictory results. In terms of internal sort of government analysis, where it's not so important to get a star, that's important instead to, minimize some sort of loss function, basically to come to arrive at a conclusion that produces the best consequences. Again, you're going to come to a very different conclusion based on what measure you use, and that is, well, let me put it like this. If we knew which measure was the best, it wouldn't be a problem because we would just pick that one. But all of these measures have strengths and weaknesses. They all have advantages and disadvantages in terms of their coverage, in terms of how they're constructed, in terms of exactly what concept of corruption to which they correspond. And so either we're going to have a very long, stultifying argument about which measure is the right one for this particular whatever particular role or thing to which we're putting it, which, is probably appropriate. Or we're going to try to say, well, is there some common, if there exists, if there really is some aggregate corruption level, if that's a valid concept that we can measure, why don't we try to get it so that we can then talk about that? And coming up with a measure of that common concept or aggregate measure or aggregate level of corruption, that's not the only, that doesn't solve every problem, right? It still, for example, would be very advantageous to have sector-specific measures of corruption. It would still be important to have, let's say, geographically disaggregated measures, right? Like, I want to know what corruption is in American states, not just at the United States at a high level, for lots of different, for tons of reasons. So this doesn't address every potential problem that exists. It does address the problem of if all these measures, these 5 measures we've been talking about, if they're all trying to measure aggregate corruption, and they say they're measuring the same thing for the most part, or they think they are, I think, then we should be getting similar answers out of them, and we're not. And that, so either aggregate corruption doesn't exist, or we are measuring it suboptimally. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the position, I'm going to assume that there is such a concept and see if we can recover it. So I'm starting with the assumption that there's a measure of corruption in a country at a time, and that is some unknown function of time and also noise or an error term. And this is the most general way of writing what a measure of corruption is that I can. It's some kind of trajectory and some kind of error, right? And right now, I'm not really saying what it is. I'm just saying it's something. Well, the first thing I'm going to do, and this is where Joseph's earlier question comes in, I'm going to extract the fixed effects for country and the fixed effects for time, which correspond to the between country differences. So the first line here, this is between country, or this is between country differences in the measure. So that's what ends up being this A term, which is just an average trajectory level for all the countries over time. Oh, no, yeah, that's right. And then the second line here, or the third, I guess technically the fifth line, is I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to average at every time period all the countries to get an overall global level of corruption trend. So A is at the country level tells me what's the average level of corruption in this country, averaging over every time period. And P is just what's the average corruption level around the world in a particular year. And I'm going to basically estimate those things to get rid of them, because what I want is what's left. What I want is omega hat, which is whatever in-country trend in this corruption measure exists. It also consists of some error, right? So now I've got a measure of whatever is changing about this measure inside of a country over time, getting rid of global trends, getting rid of between country differences. So that's the data that I have. This is what we call the panel adjusted measure of corruption, where we're getting rid of between country variance, we're getting rid of between global over time variance. Then what I want to say is, okay, so a perfect measure of corruption would have some linear relationship with the true unknown measure of corruption, which we're going to call psi, in a country at a particular time. And it would also include some extraneous variance, which might be error. It also might be bias. It's other stuff that affects a country's change in corruption. And we obviously don't have a pure measure of within country changes in the measure. We have an estimate of that change, which we calculated with our fixed effects model. And if I just plug that into the equation, what I get is that my estimate of corruption in a particular country is a linear function of the true value of corruption and something else, right? Bias and noise. So my within country trend in corruption is both a function of the actual level of corruption that exists in that country at that time and stuff I'd rather it not be in there, right? Noise and bias. And when I write the model in this way, and then this third line here just changes that into a matrix form, what you find is we have written a principal component analysis model. That is a very old, venerable, well understood statistical model of a latent variable. And what's nice about this model, other than the fact that it's very well understood and it's implemented in every statistical analysis package, is that it makes relatively few assumptions about the relationship between the extraneous variance that's new and the actual target of the measurement of corruption. All that we need is that the extraneous variance and the target corruption are unrelated. We actually can have lots of other problems that PCA will be able to overcome. So we do have to make some assumptions. We have to assume that um, we actually have different measures. In other words, we can't just put in copies of the same measure um, that would violate a rank condition. It also doesn't really make sense. You can't extract new information from the same information repeated. And like I said, we need to assume that whatever bias or extraneous variance is in our measures is not corruption, right? It's something else. We also, and this is, I think, the most substantively important thing, we have to assume that there is such a thing as psi. We have to assume that there is an aggregate level of corruption in a country at a time. And I can't prove that. I can show you that there is. I can show you in a second. There is a common signal in all these different measures of corruption. So that suggests that they all track a common component. But ultimately, I have to assume that the thing I'm trying to measure actually exists. The advantages are the sources of the data, like the individual measures of corruption that I'm going to clean with my PCA process. They might be biased. They might be noisy. The noise between them actually can be correlated, which happens for lots of reasons. For example, if if rating agencies or survey respondents are looking at each other and when they're making their judgments about the level of corruption in a country, that will create error correlation among them. That's fine. We don't actually require new to have some sort of nice structure. We just need it to be orthogonal to the real value of corruption. It's also okay if there's some overlap among the sources of data used to construct the component measures. Now, it can't be perfect overlap. That would violate the rank condition. It also, there needs to be some novel information in each of the indices. But if they share some, like for example, if the World Bank Governance Indicator has a survey that's also somehow present in the BCI, that's okay, as long as they're different in some other ways. And if we have missing data for countries or years, which is a very common problem, you saw in that earlier table, some measures were missing for certain countries, they were missing for certain time periods. We can actually use the PCA, an extension of the PCA model, to recover that missing data. So we can essentially, as long as there's at least some of the measures are available for a year and a country, we can recover hopefully what the true value of the corruption score is for that country at that time, even if some of the component measures are not available. Joseph.
Yes. Could you say something a little more about the point of a shared data sources among components measures being okay? For two reasons. One is that I think it would be good to remind everyone that, especially with the largest composite indices such as CPI and the World Bank one, they don't collect original data. They combine data from third-party sources, right? And
Yep.
in some cases, they share some of those sources as well.
And
Eh,
in some cases, one of the measures is an input to the other. So in some cases, like for example, either formally or informally, like so formally, sometimes it's not supposed to be the case, for example, that the ICRG references the TICPI. But informally, they might. They might look at each other. And then, of course, sometimes formally, like there are like the Global Corruption Barometer, I want to say that's a survey of popular perceptions of corruption between countries and over time. That is actually in both the WBGI and the BCI, I think. So there are surveys that are sort of explicitly in both.
right. So could you then explain again how? So why is it that the PCA, as it is identifying a latent factor across these different measures, when these different measures share some data sources, how do you make sure that the PCA is not just grabbing on to that, you know, one data set that all of them are using and borrowing from?
Yep. So two things. First, um, let's start with a sort of practical demonstration. So in the paper and in the appendices, we do some simulations where we create a situation where, for example, the error terms of multiple measures of corruption are correlated with each other. We also, that's not this one, but a different one, we create measures where the same information is being put into multiple measures, right? Like us, there's some novel components and there are also some shared components. And so our different measures of corruption are recovering both of those. First of all, it can be shown via proof that linear additive shared components is mathematically identical to a correlated error term. So you can actually show that at least for some forms of combination of similar sources, that problem is the same as the problem of correlated error. From a simulation perspective, what you can see is if you look at, let's say, the true within country trend in corruption and the raw corruption measures that include this correlated error, they're not very associated with each other, right? They're correlated in our little simulation at about 0.3, 0.35. But with the PCA measure, they are much more strongly correlated. And how strongly depends on how correlated the error is. So when the error is very correlated, the PCA is able to extract less information. Which makes sense because there's just less novel information in the measures when they're so closely correlated with each other. But we do always see an improvement. So from a simulation perspective, we can verify that PCA is actually able to extract a signal from biased and error correlated component measures even when some measures share the same bias and even when some measures have common components, right? They come from the same data, even when some of the measures have correlated error terms. So for those, there are also formal proofs that show that PCA is consistent in large samples as long as the conditions I mentioned earlier are met. So one could go pursue that angle as well. I'm not, just because PCA is a pretty well understood model. And so what's crucial though is that whatever signal of corruption is there, it has to be orthogonal to this bias and error component. And basically what we have to say is if the bias actually contains corruption, then it is corruption, right? Like, so we're extracting components of bias that are not corruption, that are not aggregate corruption. Joseph, I see that, I don't know if I finished your question, but James has a question too. James, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So I'm James Anderson from the World Bank. Been following the measuring corruption topic for my entire career at the bank. So area super interesting to me. So, but just I put my hand up at this point because I just following on Joseph's point in question. So the worldwide governance indicators follows a very similar methodology. So it's also an unobserved component model based on whatever is available, lots of different things, including ICRG and VDEM.
Yep.
are components in there. So I guess I'm also kind of wondering about using that as an input to another unobserved components model. So it's just a little bit puzzling to me. I guess I have some other comments, but I'll save them till the end. But that was just a kind of point of fact, I guess, about the correlations between these. So it's definitional that ICRG is part of the worldwide governance indicators. It used to be part of CPI as well. I haven't followed that as closely, and VDEM as well. VDEM and ICRG are both kind of independent in the sense that they're, as you said, they're, expert opinions, and
Well,
maybe they
not
look at each
nominally.
other's, yeah, maybe they look at each other's indexes, et cetera, but they're not like mathematically, mechanically derived from each other, whereas worldwide governance indicators is a mechanical, it's a weighted average of what's available, which is different in different countries and different time periods, but includes ICRG because it's been around for the longest time. I would say also ICRG is interesting because it's what's the word? The assessments are made at that point in time, as opposed to like VDEM, where
They're
going back to the
retrospective.
18th century is someone today or a few years
The
ago
new ones are
sitting.
contemporaneous, but yeah, the older one, and
Right.
there are also
Yeah.
revisions. They will change them if they change their mind.
Yeah. So
Well,
anyway,
okay,
just
so there's a lot of questions there. So let me start at the top. First of all, yes, it is a concern that these measures, sometimes explicitly, sometimes maybe not explicitly, but maybe anyway, they do include each other. They're looking at each other. And there's some evidence that even when they're not allegedly looking at each other, they actually are. You can see, for example, there is a relationship between sort of post-publication. You can look at sort of lagged correlations among them, and you can see them reacting to each other. So I think even when they're not explicitly related, they probably are related, at least in some ways. That's a big concern. It's also a concern that the ICRG, I'm sorry, the WBGI, CCE, and some other ones too, explicitly include each other as components. And like I said, sometimes I think they do, even when they say they don't. However, first of all, the Kaufman-Cray-Mastruzzi unobserved components model is not the same as PCA. I spent a lot of time looking at this because I was also concerned. First of all, I don't want to duplicate their work, and secondly, I wanted to figure out if there were any advantages or disadvantages of taking various approaches. The unobserved components model they use is arguably simpler, but it imposes more assumptions. It's essentially a complex weighted average, but it assumes independence in errors across sources and homoscedastic errors within a source. PCA does not. PCA relies on orthogonality of the error and the signal. And my recollection, now I'm reaching beyond, I mean, I'm relying on some pretty old memories here. My recollection is that means that PCA would be consistent, whereas the Kaufman-Cray and Mastruzzi model, or unobserved components model, would be conditional on its assumptions, unbiased in small samples. So the PCA model could be more data heavy, or require more data, more input to be effective. However, the PCA model is essentially, well, if we think it's a close cousin to factor analysis. And what's the difference between factor analysis and regression? Well, we're minimizing Euclidean distance as opposed to minimizing some sort of one-dimensional error term. And so what we have to essentially assume for PCA is that there is a factor that is meaningful and that it's orthogonal to the stuff we don't want. And so when we put things in there more than once, right? When we put basically the ICRG and the TICPI and the VDEM in with the WBGI CCE, which sort of includes some of those things, we are in effect creating a correlation, two correlations, a correlation in their signals, so they all contain some signal, and when we put things in more than once, we're duplicating that signal, We're also duplicating some of the error, right? We're putting in the error, the biases and errors they make more than once. And so what we're doing is we are adding in information of two kinds that we need to then separate. And so the process works effectively because, first of all, even though they do contain each other, they're not identical to each other, right? There is novel information contained in all these different measures, even when they do look at each other. And secondly, the fact that they're going in more than once, we can still conceptually and mathematically decompose those components into signal and noise, and PCA is able to separate them. So this is sausage, right? In the sense that in fact, this is sausage made of sausage, right? In many cases, in fact, one could argue it's sausage made of sausage made of sausage at some levels. And nothing's going to change that. However, there is actually something to be gained by all this processing. And I have some proofs that show that. I'm not a high econometrician, so don't get too excited. But I can at least show you that. Under some pretty basic assumptions about how these measures look at each other, that would be the same as they're having correlated errors. And I can also show you that if they have correlated errors, both in theory and also in simulations, the PCA-based measure does better. I can also show you, and so this is factor loadings. If you look at panel-adjusted measures and raw measures, what I can show you is that all of the 5 component measures that we looked at, the panel-adjusted and the raw measures, they all pretty much load positively on a single principal component, which is encouraging because that suggests that there is such a signal. In other words, there is a principal component. There is some sort of aggregate level of corruption trending over time in these countries. But if we leave in the between country variance, the R squared is huge, right? Basically, that component dominates all these different measures. When we take out the between country variance and the global trend, that R squared plummets, right? So, but it's still large, but it's much smaller than when we have the raw measures. So for that reason, I think, okay, well, there is such a thing as corruption. There is this signal. All these measures are better at identifying it between countries, comparing countries as opposed to within countries, but the signal is still there. On the other hand, if we think of like what's the second biggest principal component for the raw measures without panel adjustment, that explains very little of the variance. In other words, whatever noise or bias is there is just not that important. But when we're looking at trends within countries, that bias is actually substantially important, right? It also explains quite a lot of the variation in the component measures, and they're different from each other. The VDEM loads differently on whatever this. I don't even know what the second component is. It could be another aspect of corruption. It could be some sort of bias. Some measures load positively on it, some measures load negatively on it, some measures don't load on it very much at all. And that suggests to me that there is, some shared bias that's also different among the measures, right? Some of them have more of it or less of it, or even go in opposite directions on it. So for all these reasons, I think my sausage made of sausage is good sausage. But it is sausage, right? It is not raw meat, right? It's not new data. It's fundamentally a process, right? It's a processing. On the good side, that means when we get new data, we can put that into this process, and hopefully the sausage that comes out will be better. Did I answer both of you guys' questions before I quickly talk about my application? Okay, so I'm going to criticize myself. This is a paper I published with my co-author Leslie Schwint-Bayer in Comparative Political Analysis, we were interested in, oh, is that right? No, comparative political studies. I conflated comparative political studies and political analysis. I just started a new journal. Anyway, whatever. I'm estimating the causal effect of women's representation on corruption, which is a theoretically important thing. We are used instruments to try to identify the causal relationship among the two. The primary instruments were first and second lag values of women's proportion in parliament. This is a sort of Ariano-Bond, Blundell-Bond type dynamic panel instrument model. We can talk about why you would or wouldn't want to use fixed effects for countries in this case. There are various reasons why that might be a good or a bad idea. Nickel bias is why it's a bad idea, but residual confounding is why it might be a good idea. Long story short, we in our analysis, this is the table I showed you earlier, we relied on two sets of instruments and two dependent variables. And what we effectively found was for the ICRG, there's a strong negative relationship between women in parliament and corruption. We find that with two different sets we actually have a second set of instruments we find that with. I believe we also use the CPI, and we found that with the other set of instruments, there is an effect that's statistically significant, and in this case, it's statistically insignificant. Again, I'm relying on some pretty old memories here, but I'm pretty sure we used two measures. If you use all five of them, right? If you just dump them all in, well, you get pretty inconsistent results, which I showed you earlier. Now, I could say, and I think I did at the time, like, well, the World Bank Governance Indicator is available for a relatively small number of years. That's going to hurt my ability to identify the effect of women in the lower house on corruption, especially since this is a dynamic model. Therefore, it's really relying on changes. And I want to just step back here and say, as a sort of broad problem, it's really important to have trends because so many of the things we do depend on the trends being valid. If you're estimating a difference in difference model, you need the trends to be valid because that's what you're studying, right? You're studying a difference in trends. If you're using a dynamic panel model, you need the trends to be accurate because otherwise the dynamics are going to be wrong, which means everything's going to be wrong. If you're actually, well, I could go on, but this is an example of where we really need the dynamics to be right. And what we found in the original paper is that a 10-point increase in women's representation was associated with roughly a 1-point drop in corruption. We find a much smaller effect, but a statistically significant one. So using the new PCA-based measure. So the new PCA-based measure does find a statistically significant decline in corruption associated with an increase of women's representation, but it's a smaller effect. These are all, I rescaled these so they're all on the same scale. So this is actually a meaningful coefficient in the sense that it actually is, a third of the size of the original finding. But because our measure is less noisy, you can actually see we're estimating it with a pretty good precision. So it's still statistically significant. And if you want to get into all the weeds here, these are models without fixed effects because the dynamic panel model essentially is inconsistent with those in there. Or no, it's biased, but it might be consistent in T, but not in N. Anyway, none of this matters. The instruments seem to be valid from a Sargan-Hansen test perspective. The first stage F statistic is huge because these are lag instruments, so obviously the instruments are going to be extremely powerful. The long run effect that we find, because this is a dynamic model, so we have both an instantaneous effect and then a cumulative effect. The cumulative effect that we find with the new PCA-based measure is that a 10-point increase in women's representation over the long term is associated with about a 2.6-point decline in corruption on a 0 to 100 scale, which is substantively meaningful, but it's a lot smaller than the original finding. But it is statistically significant. So I'm going to quickly wrap up. First takeaway, you probably already knew this if you study corruption. If you didn't, it's important to know you need to be careful when interpreting results that are dependent on within country trends in corruption. And for a lot of scientific and policy research, that's a lot of them, right? If you're trying to figure out what caused corruption in a particular country to go up or down, and you have a measure of that, your results may widely vary depending on what measure you choose. And therefore, you need to make sure that your conclusions are assessed with respect to their robustness to the choice of measure. That's something we pretty much already knew, I think, but this highlights the importance of it. A new thing you can do is extract a common factor using PCA from multiple corruption measures, and then use the, after you've removed between country differences and global trends, you can extract the common signal using PCA and use that resulting PCA score as its own measure of corruption. And if you do that, you can do better in terms of modeling the shared component of corruption that is latent in all of the observed measures of corruption that you have access to, which you have access. So in summary, we have this model. It should be more effective than existing procedures at extracting common signals of change. And it's robust to a lot of the problems that we associate with trying to measure corruption. I do want to emphasize this is not a panacea. It does not answer every critique. It does not solve every problem. But I think it does answer an important problem, and that's why we're offering it. So thanks for your attention. I think I've hit my hour, so I'm going to stop. And Joseph, do you want to moderate the questions? How do you want to do this?
Yes, thank you, Justin. I think it's best if you can stop sharing your screen, and then we can
I can do that, yeah.
for some discussion here. I see a couple of hands already up. Let's start with Saverio.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Justin, for your very inspirational paper. It was super interesting and timely. And I have a couple of questions. One that it's more technical and then more philosophical, if you want. And the first one is about the imputation process that you briefly mentioned. And if you don't think that during the imputation process of missing data, you can enlarge and to stress some possible underlying trends in the missing data, if the missing data are telling us something. For example, we're missing data in some specific areas or some specific countries that are important because, for example, are more corrupted than others, so they produce less qualitative data, and so you are enlarging this trend, and this affect the result. And another more general question is that if you don't think that your results are a good argument, a good, strong, and very inspirational argument against the research of corruption at country level, in the sense that also in your result, the magnitude of coefficient decrease compared to other stuff, and so probably most of the future research, in your opinion, should concentrate the effort in the local level against this global trend in corruption. Also, because I'm not so surprised that different measures, in the sense that different measures reflect different philosophical setting, in the sense that, for example, most of the definition of corruption are not the same. Most are relying on a restriction of competition, other on the lack of transparency, and, for example, are not applicable and extendable to all possible contexts and all of possible area of the world. So probably your argument are very good in to say, okay, guys, there are some global trends, but are not so interesting, but like the very local or regional trends.
So I'll start with the second question, which is really about, is cross-national country level research advisable on corruption? I think, although it is not the only thing that we ought to be doing, it is an important thing to do. And why do I think that? First, a lot of the variation in institutions is at the country level, right? The United States is unusual in that it has a high degree of federalism, but most countries are unitary. And if we think that institutions matter, which I suspect most political scientists do, we want to study the effect of those institutions on corruption. It's also a lot of what the instruments that are available to national governments are, sort of national level institutions. I certainly don't think that there is only one possible way to define corruption, and that it's not appropriate to choose a measure that matches the concept you're trying to study. Yeah, you definitely should do that. And if one of the component measures is that, then arguably that's what you should do. However, I do think that there is such a thing, and we know from the theory about corruption, there is such a thing as a culture of corruption, right? There is such a thing as pervasive or not pervasive, right? Or sort of inhibited overall level corruption. So to take an example, in the United States right now, I think it is fair to say that incidences of corruption by certain people and certain sectors are going up, but there's still a pretty dominant culture of condemnation of corruption, of stigmatization of corruption, that has not yet been eliminated. And that is a real thing. It exists. As a concept, I want to capture it. For that reason, I do think that having a measure of that aggregate level of the pervasiveness of corruption in a country is important, because it relates to things that we think affect corruption, and it is a concept. It is a thing that we are interested in from a theoretical perspective, because building that resilient culture is a big part of reducing corruption. To answer your first question more briefly about probabilistic principal components analysis, yeah, I didn't talk about that in detail just because this talk's already went long. So I'll just say that you don't have to do it, but if you don't do it, then when any of the component measures are missing, then the higher level, the sort of aggregated measure, will also be missing. And there is extensive study of the consequences of imputation versus not imputing. And essentially, if the data are missing at random or missing conditionally at random, we should be reasonably confident that the imputation process makes things better. And in the case of corruption measures, sometimes that's pretty reasonable. So sometimes measures are missing just because, for example, in the early days, the World Bank governance indicators just didn't collect, they just didn't estimate the measures for like 95 and 97 or whatever. That didn't have anything to do with anything as far as I know. Sometimes it might not be missing completely at random, but it might be conditionally missing at random. And if it's conditional on the level of corruption, then the other measures in the model hopefully are control for that. So I do have some reasons to believe that imputation is the right way to go here. But you don't have to do it. What it's going to do is it's going to make the missingness problem worse, because if you have 5 measures, now you need all 5 of them to be present to extract the common signal.
Thank you very much.
I don't know who was next. I don't know if it's James or Giovanna.
Next is Giovanna.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, sorry, it's possible that James goes first. I need to connect my computer first.
Okay.
Of course, James, please.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so a really interesting paper and good answers to a lot of tough questions, particularly like this last one on the value of country level analysis and why we do it. I'm still, nevertheless, I still have the same kind of question about what it means to look at a country the size of China or the United States and come up with one number, like which is what ICRG does, or other expert rating agencies. One number on something which is not really precisely defined. And I know that's the whole point of what you're doing, is to try to make sense of something when there are so many different definitions. So I know you're cognizant of that challenge. But I think coming back to the main objective and the title about measuring over time, my conclusion from long ago is that you can't escape the questions of definition of what you're trying to measure and being sure that you have a measure that is that has some kind of a cardinal scale, GDP, it's unbounded, goes up forever, something that's a share, a crime rate, or, something that's per 100,000. And so when I've wrestled with this question about changes over time, because you do wonder, after a lot of years and a lot of effort, are things getting better or worse at an individual country level or at a global level? And are we capable of answering that question? And not very. We're not very capable, but I tend towards measures that are well defined. So the World Bank Enterprise Surveys is sort of my fallback. Your challenge there is that it's not done every country every year. It's a small number of countries. It's very scattered. I've made some attempts to somehow come up with an answer despite those challenges myself. But anyway, I think if you ultimately, to be able to say, are things getting better or things getting worse, you need to have a scale. So something like the Worldwide Governance Indicators actually is rescaled every time it's done to have a mean of 0. So it's not going to help you. And I think that's only one of multiple reasons why I wouldn't ever use it for looking at changes over time. And that's as a peer reviewer, that's a consistent comment I make within the bank. Yeah. So, okay, a couple other small points. Maybe I'll just send you offline in case they're
Yeah,
helpful.
I'm happy to let me take on that big one because yeah, what's the difference, for example, between measuring GDP and human flourishing, right? Which, there are these various people that want to measure eudaimonia or whatever. It's a measure is only as consistent, valid, and reliable as the existence of the concept to which it is tied. I do think there is a consistent concept behind aggregate corruption, which is essentially to what extent, what is the frequency and severity to which public officials abuse their office for private gain. That is hard to scale. One could imagine trying to scale it in proportion to GDP, sort of trying to measure literally what are the deadweight losses created by, in dollars and cents that are created by corrupt activities. But it is also a composite, right? It is a huge aggregation of lots of different activities. And I guess I'm more comfortable with that kind of composite measure just because a lot of concepts in, for example, in psychology are not things that we can count in the way that you are wanting to count, right? So, for example, the big 5 personality characteristics. I cannot scan your brain and come up with openness on a fMRI measure, right? But I can consistently identify that openness is a thing that exists in people and it very consistently predicts what they do and how they act. So I guess this is why a natural scientist would hate me, right? Like I don't, or would hate the social sciences or hate this in particular because it doesn't correspond to a physical referent that is very easily and straightforwardly recoverable. On the other hand, I mean, these things like corruption, also personality characteristics, to some extent are emergent characteristics, right? They're emergent from physical systems. And so to try to tie them to a physical referent the way we would tie it to like dollars, is going to be hard. I do, however, want to say that your point about the necessity for conceptual clarity is correct. No amount of processing is going to take a muddle and make it something important. This project depends on there being a common factor, right? There has to be a common factor. And I think there is. I have evidence that there is. They are tracking something in common. And I do think, for example, we can say that corruption in China is going down based on probably I would be a little more reticent to say it's because of Xi Jinping's policies, but that's at least something I would want to investigate, right? I think that corruption in China is going down at an aggregate level. Now, if we started to get into individual sectors, well, or individual regions, that's another matter. But I do think there is an aggregate culture of corruption or lack thereof in a country, and I think it changes. And I think in the United States, it is starting very slowly to go up, but very slowly, and tentatively. So yeah, I mean, I guess that we're probably not going to resolve what is, as you mentioned, a philosophical, not a disagreement, but just a difference in approach. But I do think there is something here. Joseph, do you want to?
Yes. Joanna, now do you feel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Well, first of all, I really appreciate your presentation. Joseph and I have been discussing in the last years about measuring corruption, and as you say, you as you say, it's difficult to measure because it's difficult to identify the resources, and we have all of these different measures of corruption. Joseph and I, we have been trying to identify what are the best measures and what are the difference between those measures. And I think that you have here a great contribution to the literature on measuring corruption. So I really like the paper. I really like your job. I have been reading the working paper that you have been updated in your webpage. And here, I just have like two questions just to improve this discussion about measuring corruption. The first question is related to the model. You say that you are using PCA because PCA use less assumptions, but PCA has two main assumptions. The one assumption is the orthogonality of the errors, and the second assumption is the linearity between the measures.
Yep.
So I am wondering what if we use another kind of method to aggregate or to decompose the parts of the measures. For example, semi-parametric models or not parametric models that allow me to get rid of the assumption of the linearity, and maybe we can use another kind of configurations between the variables, between the different indexes. And the other question is,
wait, before you get to that, Lenny, because I want to, can I answer that one first, just because that's a complicated one, and I don't want to muddle my answer. I like that you brought up the assumption of linearity. It is correct. That is something I want to improve in the draft, because especially when we're talking about the equivalence and error correlation and multiple overlapping data sources in the composite measures, that also relies on linearity. My little demonstration relies on linearity. So that is true. And why don't we use non-parametric measures? Because it's hard, and because you're going to throw away a ton of efficiency. At least unless someone comes up with a radically different process than the usual processes. I've studied non-parametric models at some points in my career pretty extensively, not recently. But the thing I came away with is you're either going to put assumptions back in, or you're going to throw away massive amounts of efficiency. So I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Yes. Thank you very much. Yes, I remember also my my professor at the econometrics when they say, okay, sufficiency versus versus bias. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a real thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the second question is related to do the same, but with the raw data. Maybe if we are going to, we go to the resources. For I mapped in another paper all the resources for these indexes, and yeah, I have most of them because there are some private data. But what to do? What do you think about doing the same but with the raw data? Maybe we can have the best ways to combine these different meats to produce the good sausage. What do you think about that?
Well, so the measures are much better in their raw form when we're looking at between country variance. So there's less of a need just because the R's are so high, or the rows are so high in the between country variance. So you certainly can apply this method to raw measures. You can apply it to measures that I did not use. You could apply it, for example, to the component. You could construct a version of the WBGI CCE that instead of using Kaufman, Cray, and Mastruzzi's unobserved components model, use PCA. And so you could take their raw source. They're actually, I think they make a lot of that available. You can actually get the raw data and you could build it that way if you wanted to. So there's nothing wrong with that. You could also, I mean, these are all pretty off-the-shelf methods. And you can see we have a Dataverse or whatever, a dereplication file online. You can see exactly what we did. And you could easily adapt that code to just feed in whatever underlying measures you had and accomplish the same goal. I will say the standard thing, which is just if you go off the reservation that I've created, you may encounter unexpected difficulties that I didn't anticipate. So that's just a standard warning of, if you do this, something might happen that I didn't anticipate. But in principle, yes, you could do it.
Thank you.
Great. For what? For what are you with us?
Oh, there he is.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. I'm very thankful for this great presentation, and I'd really like this approach. I'll go back to the set of the concepts we have been discussing nearly. I can see that there is a very big defect on the definition of corruption. We are trying, as before and earlier was said by our colleagues, that we are collecting a lot of concepts in one package to have one number for all of these concepts. But eventually, we need this number, as you said. We need to have this one number. The current definition of corruption is not helping us to do that. Currently, I'm studying a new definition of corruption that I would like to share with the group, and I would like to hear from all of you about it, and to see how this can help us to identify the measuring tools that needed for it. The proposed definition is that corruption is the misuse of authority and responsibilities against the values of its source. So here we are talking, I'll say it again, it's the misuse of authorities and responsibilities against the values of its source. So basically, when we have an authority, it's built according to a source of this authority. And this source of authority have its own values that want to be implemented according the process of this authority that should be kept. So when we talk about all kinds of corruptions on the state level, on the private sector and extra, it couldn't be collected together. This is very different source of values and very different values that couldn't be measured together. At least it needs to be measured separately, and then it needs to be equalized on a statistical model. So what we need to start with is to find the, when we talk about each corruption activity or practices, we need to see basically what the authority used for it, and what was the source of this authority, and what was the main values that this source want to implement. And when we can measure the deviation between the values of the source and the values of the corrupted person, or the results that have been gained by the corrupted person, at this point we can say this is the angle of corruption. If we revised many of the indices that use now according to this set of values or set of philosophical approach, it might help us to figure easily the different and very different types of corruption. And I have set a taxonomy that's nearly containing now more than 2.4 million different corruption type in a very large taxonomy database. According to that, we have aggregated groups that we doesn't used to manage to put it together early. We put it on the indexes very late when we try to measure it, but it needs to be measured early together, and we can easily say this set is according to that values, and this set is according to that values. You can think it easily. An analogy for it is the human body. When we are working with the disease on the human body, we are trying basically to find a medicine for each organ. So each organ would be surveyed, tested, and have its medicines, and it have its own doctors. But what we are trying now to do is to give a medicine for all the body. Maybe sometimes it's acceptable, but most of the time you need to manage each organ and each function and what its purpose and why it's working this type and what is malfunctioning on it.
All right, so
I would.
Would it be okay if I responded to this? Because so first of all, I'm going to start with your metaphor. There are such things as broad spectrum antibiotics, right? Where we don't actually know exactly what bug is causing an illness, but we have a medicine that applies broadly. But they don't always work, and sometimes it's important to target. So the first thing I'll say is the component measures that go into anything like this, right? The WBGI-CCE, the BCI, or the thing I made, they can be targeted in the way that you're suggesting, right? They can, for example, say, the difference between a gift and a bribe is different in some cases based on the cultural context, and so they're going to account for that in how we assess the pervasiveness of corruption in those countries. And so at the lower level, sometimes these things can be integrated. However, I do think that there is such a thing as essentially the extent to which private gain is necessary to extract public services, right, or some sort of public benefit. So, for example, no matter how we think about the nature of how corruption is defined in a particular society, there's going to be something that in that society that constitutes an illegitimate, privatization of the public benefit. And in so much that is the case, I think we can measure it.
Yes.
So that's what these aggregate measures are trying to do.
If you allow me, the point here that we cannot compare each society and each case together with the same practice itself. Like the example you said about the gifts. In some societies, in the very developed and Western and well indexed states, gifts are accepted because the values of this society or the authority that is in this point of the transaction is made by some type of society or source of the authority that have values that allow you to accept these gifts. So if these values can be measured or set, that on this particular case, the values was that we are to enhance the correlation in the church. And in the church, we can accept gifts from each other. And the person in authority on the church is allowed to accept the gifts. So the values here allow this action. And it will not be accepted. And somehow this church is a public organization or have a common fund that could be oriented somehow to serve the profit of some of the groups, but it will not be a corruption in this case because the authority source allow it. But what we do now, that we ignore the authority sources and we ignore all the values on the world, and we say we have one strict line that should be straight all over all the societies, all the states, and this one line will be the only corruption line we have. Actually, it's not one corruption. We are talking about several thousands of corruptions. It's like trying to give one medicine for all the states. If you try to cure this corruption type by the same way, or try to measure it by the same way in different societies, it cannot be. Like it's like dancing about architecture, something that couldn't be done.
If I may add something or intercede there as well, because I feel like we're approaching now a more philosophical discussion about the concept of corruption and the nature of measurement. I certainly don't disagree with what Justin did mention that any of these measures of corruption, they are aggregates not just of data sources, but of what corruption is, right? There's not the one corruption. And if there is, it's still an aggregate of multiple activities and behaviors and ideas of what corruption is. Even just going through the methodology or the list of questions of the data sources are used by Transparency International in the Corruption Perception Index, for example. If we wanted to extract the core concept of each one of those questions, each one of them can be debated. And I have certainly tried. So that's really an interesting discussion. Potentially one that goes beyond just the statistical analysis of these different measurements.
Yeah, it's not a statistical question. I mean,
Right.
it's at all. It's
Right.
actually another analogy to something I used to study in a past life. Consider the concept of fairness. There are differences culturally in what is considered fair and unfair, but the concept of fairness is pretty universal. And so we can try to measure the extent to which every particular group of people, culture, whatever you might want to call it, is fair. We can measure it on its own terms, but then we can say, well, some countries by their own terms are less fair and some by their own terms are more fair. So there is still a concept that can be compared, even if we don't necessarily apply the same low-level formulaic rules at the lowest level to measure it. That's essentially what I have. In order for anything I'm doing to make sense, what you have to believe is there is a concept called corruption that is comparable.
So just
And if you don't believe that, then none of this is going to make any sense.
Allow me to abuse my position to fit in one final question, even though I know that we are beyond the time allotted for this conversation. Did corruption go up or down during the Obama administration? That was one of the
It stayed
questions
the
you
same.
started the presentation with. Stay the same.
It stayed the same.
All right.
Which, you know what? That was kind of what I figured intuitively. Man, it didn't really change much, and it stayed the same. Yeah.
It's funny that you say, because when you asked it, I tried to think about it for myself, and I'm like, actually, I never, yeah, I don't perceive much of a difference between 2009 to 2016 in the US, right?
Yeah, it stayed the same.
Yeah. Now, if we were to compare it with 2024 or 2025, potentially they are
That, you
something
know, on
different.
that one, I actually have recently done a lot of looking at those things, and they actually don't agree on that either very much,
Mhm.
actually. But the overall and some of these things are happening so fast, like the changes that have happened in the second Trump administration, they're not being picked up by anything right now. But democracy and corruption scores went nuts in 2016,
Mhm.
and for what I hope are obvious reasons, at least in the United States. And it's going to take, I think, some time to really hash out what happened there.
One last thing. Julia Mogherini had to leave a little early, but she left a question in the chat for you. So she was talking about the stickiness of corruption measurement, especially in composite indices, right? This idea of there's little variance from year to year on how a country is doing, regardless of the policies implemented. Do you find also that to be the case in the PCA results?
This is really hard because essentially it has been said that getting the same answer over a number of years is a good sign for corruption
Right.
measures, but it's also a bad sign if the actual level of corruption is changing, right? So this is a problem where if we knew the underlying truth, if we actually knew what the level of corruption was in a country year to year, we could assess reliability in that way because the same measure should give the same result when exposed to the same stimuli. But we don't actually know whether the stimuli are changing. So a corruption measure that doesn't change very much year over year could be good or bad, and we don't know, right? It depends on what the truth is, and we're getting to the truth by measuring it. And see this circular definition here. So like it may be good or bad. We don't actually know, and that's what I'm trying to figure out is I'm trying to statistically separate out, right, um, the error or bias from the signal.
Yeah. And I think this is a fantastic contribution to the field, Justin. Thank you. I mean, I'm really grateful for your work, and I feel like I can speak on behalf of at least some of my colleagues. This was a fantastic paper, and I really look forward to seeing it published and share it and continue the conversation. Thank you
Well, thank you very
for
much for the comments. I'm actually going to make a few small changes to the paper. It can't be about, basket weaving now. I think political studies would be upset, but if I radically changed it. But I am going to make some small changes, I think, and certainly for future work, I appreciate all the feedback.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone, and continue enjoying International Anti-Corruption Day. Take good care.
Thank you, guys.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.